Greetings! Welcome back to the Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel for another in our hide tanning series. Previously, we have done videos on alum tanning. We have done videos on brain tanning. This is going to be a video on bark tanning or vegetable tanning. Now, I'll make sure that there's a link at the end screen to this video to the playlist, which has all of this stuff in it in one easy to access location. But I want to specifically mention that earlier, as part of this series, I did a video with the chemical and biological content which explains what tanning is, how these different processes relate to each other, and the nuts and bolts of what's going on. So a lot of the content in there I'm not going to specifically discuss in this or the other individual videos. But if you want to jump and watch that before you watch this particular piece of content, I'll put a link right here at the top of the screen so that you can pause this and go and get those nuts and bolts if you wish to. The basic content of bark tanning or vegetable tanning, there are other sources of tannin besides just tree bark. But in all of these cases, what you're doing is you're going to extract tannic acid from a vegetation source, and then you're going to immerse the hides in that. And the tannic acid is both going to degrade the glycoproteins in the hide and act as a cross-linking agent to pull the protein fibers together. The bark tan is the strongest cross-linking agent, and it produces the strongest, most wear-resistant, most durable type of leather that there is. Okay? So that's the pro. The con is strong also means not soft, right? So you're not going to bark tan and then try to make garment leather out of it, right? This is something that you want to be durable. If you want garment leather, you want to go to brain tanning or alum tanning or one of those other methods, okay? So each has its place. The other downside to bark tanning is it takes a very, very long time. This intro is actually the last clip that I filmed in this video. Some of the clips are a little out of order here, although they're lined up with the chronology that you will use when you actually execute the procedure. But it is late October, and I started these hides in August, and they're about a third done. Right? This is a very long process. It takes time to veg tan. It just does, and you can't speed it up, so you have to be prepared for that. It's also a little bit more difficult than some of the other methods, and it's of them, it's the one I have the least experience with. So this is my second attempt at bark tanning. Okay, and it's going fairly well. This is an intermediate. I'm ending this video at the intermediate step, and we will do another video in spring or summer when they're finished. And it's going well. But I have done some troubleshooting as I've gone through this process because I'm less familiar with it. And I wanted to just state that and show that and talk to you about problem solving in a skill that you're a little bit new to. Okay? I am not the world's bark tanning expert, right? But knowing the background, knowing the chemistry, knowing how these things work, we can work our way through problems here or there and figure stuff out. So I wanted to just put this up here, show what I've done, show how I've worked through a few problems, and show that it's okay to have problems and work through them. That's part of the skill acquisition process. So we're going to jump right in. We're going to start with getting our bark, processing the bark, how we make the liquor, how we put the hides in it, what goes right, what goes wrong, and how we fix it. So I hope that you will join in and follow along with us as we go through this journey. Okay, we need to get the bark off of these logs in order to tan. Now, choosing bark is an important thing. You don't want to just go out to the forest, grab any old tree and start barking up the wrong tree. That would be bad. We want to bark up the right tree. Here in the East, in Eastern North America, there's really three right trees that have been used historically. Chestnut bark has been used in tanning. Oak of really all sorts has been used in tanning. And the one I'm using today is hemlock. The Eastern hemlock has been used in tanning. Okay? At some point, I'm going to do a video on the history of tanning in Eastern North America, and we're going to talk about all of these things. For now, I just want to talk about how to get the bark off the logs and focus on that. Okay? So let's look at tools. Now, I have some historic tools. I've spent a lot of time, I do collect these, and these are not just tools for using, these are examples that I want to replicate with my forge, and I'm going to do videos on that here in the future. But the traditional tool is a bark spud. This is a wrought iron spud. It has a rounded, dull point, okay? And this one's really interesting. They just took a round bar, folded it over, and that's a forge weld seam right there. You can see it on both sides, okay? And you insert this in between the bark and the sapwood, and then you just pry off bark in large sheets, okay? This is easier to do when you're not sitting. And if you have this log to roll around, you can get strips the entire length of the log and entire circumference of the log in one strip, okay? Now, these are not unfindable. These show up fairly often at, flea markets and antique shops and yard sales and whatever. These historically were a standard tool that most homesteads would have. Even if you weren't tanning your own leather, you would have these for barking trees in order as a first step in hewing them, so that you don't hew through the bark and all of the dirt that's on there and blunt your axe. Okay? So every farmstead would have some version of the bark spud. Now, often, this rounded form is the most common. Often they were socketed. This one was just made out of a solid bar. Okay? This was repurposed. I would guess that this is later, probably early 1900s, right when there's still a lot of wrought iron. It is made out of wrought iron. You can see the grain pattern in the side here. Okay? So this was made at a time when people were still forging their own tools, and there was a lot of wrought iron around, but when iron was getting cheaper, right? So this is definitely post-Bessemer. If this was made in the 1700s, nobody would ever make the entire thing out of metal because it was just too doggum expensive, right? I use a southernism there, hon. Doggum expensive, right? So this would be made as a socketed tool. This is a socketed example. This is a really interesting head on it, okay, so that this cleft could get in and split the bark, right? So when you're opening it up, this would be hafted onto a long handle. You could get in with that cleft and cut through the bark on your way, and then turn it horizontal and start prying the bark up. So that's a really interesting one. I bought that in Lycoming County, Pennsylvania. You know you're a nerd when you write provenance information on your yard sale finds. Anyway, the third tool that was historically common, this one, Franklin County, Pennsylvania, I got this piece, is a very large draw knife, okay? Now this is really interesting. This is made out of strapping from a buggy, okay? And it has a piece of steel riveted to it. So again, I would put this in the 1900s because of this piece of steel. That's very high quality modern steel. But it was made at a time when people were still forging and forging proficiently. The drawing out of this handle transition is done very proficiently, but there's a lot of shredding of the coarse wrought iron here, which tells me this was not done in a proper forge. This was probably done in a campfire. Somebody knew what they were doing, but was improvising their blacksmithing equipment, right? You can kind of tell by the forging marks. So there was a day where most farm families would have at least one person who was a fairly proficient makeshift blacksmith. Not a full cutler, not a full, I can go and make a vise from scratch, but somebody who could knock tools together like this as needed, right? So it's done proficiently, but it's done at the wrong temperature, right? It was done too cold for wrought iron. Wrought iron needs to be screaming white hot whenever you work it. So large draw knives like that are an important tool that can be used for this. And if you're thinking, well, gosh, Adam, I really want to do some tanning, but I don't have access to all of these tools, can you find a stick? I bet you can find a stick. Can you find a modern hatchet? I bet you can find a modern hatchet. We can take this modern hatchet, do just a little bit of hewing on it, okay? We've just made a bark spud, okay? And this will work just as well as the metal tools. Just kind of do this for getting in and prying off chunks of bark. Okay? So, the fresher your logs, the easier this will go. You are just fine using dry logs, but you're going to struggle with the stick method on dry logs. Okay? You're just fine using dry logs. What you don't want to use is a species that is low in tannin. Stick to the ones I mentioned, right? Really oak and hemlock in North America. Just about anywhere in North America you'll be able to find some flavor of oak or hemlock. Okay? Stick to those and make sure that you're using logs that have not been left out in the weather for long periods of time. Remember, tannins are water soluble. So if these logs are left out in the woods for 3 or 4 years, the tannin's going to wash out of them, and you're going to get a weak tanning liquor when you go to cook it down. So if you find a blowdown on property where you have permission to collect, and that tree was blown down this year, go for it. If that tree was blown down in a storm 5 years ago, move on. You're not going to get a good tanning liquor. Been there, done that, bought the failure t-shirt. Okay? So, I'm going to continue barking up the right tree, and we'll join when it's time to go forward with the next step. We have us a pile of bark. Now, this was actually spudded off of those logs several months ago. We've been working off it for a while here. It was, yay tall when we very first started this project. But I wanted to take a minute and talk about splitting it up into small chunks for cooking out the tannins. Now this is dry, and you don't have to do this dry, but since it's dry, it snaps quite nicely. So on a lot of these thinner pieces, we can break it up just by snapping it in hand. These bigger chunks, snapping it in strips, and smaller pieces, then reducing those down. And it's actually pretty crumbly stuff at this stage. Okay? If it's wet, you may or may not be able to do this. And again, this is all going to vary a lot depending on what source of bark you have. If you can't snap it by hand, or you have a piece that, brush some of the stones off of there, or you have a piece that's just recalcitrant and won't let you snap it like the rest, you have options. You can take a hatchet, and you can shave it down, get chunks off that way. Or you can take a big old loppers, anchor one end in your belly there, and then you can just work it down like this. Now, the smaller, the better. Because you have to think, water has to get into the core of this bark and allow all of those tannins to diffuse their way out. Okay? So the smaller it is and the more surface area it is, the more efficient that process is. And the more tannin total you will get out of the bark versus wasting when you discard the bark. Okay? And the closer to a powder, the better off all of this is. So, if you have, or have a friend who has, a chipper shredder, and you can just pulverize this, this would be a marvelous time to invoke a power tool. We brought the bark up from the barn. It's time to cook it. Now, there's not a whole lot of exciting stuff to show here with cooking the bark. You have your bark. you cover it with enough water so that it's completely submerged. It's floating now, but as we turn on the heat, this will absorb water, and when it's fully saturated, it won't float anymore. Okay? Now, how long do you need to cook it? And that's kind of a good question. And the answer is that there's not a single answer to that question. Okay? You got a couple of competing factors. One is that chemistry happens fast. So tannins are extraordinarily soluble. And when a tannin molecule encounters the water, it's going to dissolve almost immediately. Okay? But these pieces of bark are on the big side, right? Very much on the big side. I would much rather this was a finer granulation. And if you think about this big chunk of bark, it's got a lot of waxes in it that impede the progress of water. So while, yes, a tannin molecule on the surface in contact with the water will dissolve almost immediately, it's also true that it takes the water quite a long time to penetrate into the core of this because of those waxes. And then, after the water's penetrated from the core, the tannin has to diffuse out to the surface so that it can dissolve. That takes time. The bigger your pieces, the longer that time will take. Okay? The smaller the pieces, the less time. So what you're going to do, what you're going to have to do, is you're going to have to look at what the water looks like now. What does it look like quickly when I just mix it? You can see there's already, I just filled this up maybe 3 minutes before turning the camera on, and I'm already starting to see some red coloration and some tannins coming out. Like I said, chemistry happens fast. So you want to look at what's happening now. And then you're going to want to watch. Okay? And you boil it for a little while, and the bark sinks, right? Because it absorbed water. Well, that's a good sign. Things are going. But just because the bark has just started to sink doesn't mean you're done. That means the water's penetrated, not that all the tannins have diffused out. So you're going to watch, you're going to see how dark is the water at that point. And then you're going to walk away for a half hour and then come back. Is it darker? If yes, keep going. And you want to keep going and keep cooking until it stops getting darker. That means you've reached an equilibrium point. Okay? When the tannin content of the bark and the tannin content of the water are the same, no further dissolving of tannin occurs. Okay? At that point, you quit because you're wasting your time to go any further. And then you're going to pour that off, and you can either strain out the bark, or I will just kind of pour it off the top, let a few chunks fall in, I don't really care, and then I'll just fish them out with my fingers when it gets cool enough to touch. And you want it to get cool enough to touch before you put it on your hide. If the water is hot enough to damage skin, it's hot enough to damage skin, right? So don't pour hot water on top of your hide. It needs to be touchably comfortable to touch, okay? Or it's too hot. So it's comfortable enough to touch, I'll just scoop it in with my fingers and then put those little bits of bark back in the pot and boil it a second time. Same idea. Watch it. When it stops getting darker, pour it off, and then do it a third time. Right? You want to boil your bark at least 3 times to get an exhaustive extraction. Okay? After that, you will still get a little bit of coloration on a 4th or a 5th boil, but you're not really getting much extra tannin out. So it becomes self-defeating. There is a diminishing returns that crops up with this. Now, when you're doing this initially, you'll want to pour off those 2nd and 3rd yields, mix them together, and use that volume to submerge your hides. So you need enough volume that your hides can swim around in it easily. You don't want, your leather all wadded up in the bottom. You want it to have good circulation around it. Okay? So you're not trying to reduce the volume, we're just trying to get out the tannins. But later on in the process, and this clip is filmed a little bit out of order, I've been soaking the hides a little bit, and I'm making this particular batch to strengthen the liquor. There, I can only get so much tannin out, I will reach an equilibrium, but because I don't need, at this point, I don't need any more volume to submerge the hides deeper, I just need more tannin in what's already there. I will cook this down till there's just an inch or 2 of liquid in the bottom, so I'm almost making sort of a tannin syrup. And then use that to pour on and strengthen the liquor without increasing its volume and causing further dilution problems. Okay? So, early on you will cook it less than when you're doing that and trying to get a really concentrated boiled down extract. And if you have a chipper shredder to run this through and really pulverize the bejabbers out of it, do that, and then you'll need less cook time too. So, as with most things in the tanning of leather, this isn't so much a recipe as an opportunity to practice your skills of observation and watch what's occurring and respond to what you see. And that takes practice, but that's okay. Aha! This is future me, remembering I forgot to say something important as I was editing this video. All of the work that you do with your bark liquors needs to be in either glass, plastic, or stainless steel. I forgot to mention that. Back to the process. Well, we are making some progress. We have cooked a whole bunch of bark. This barrel contains all of our second and third cookings mixed together. Okay? The first cookings are separated out in another bucket, and those will be used to strengthen this liquor as the hides absorb the tannic acid out of it. Okay? So we've got one last batch here to go in, and I want to try and strain out most of the bark. I don't care if a little gets in there. It can actually be helpful if a little gets in there.
Try not to burn yourself.
Yeah, I don't want to burn myself. That would not be fun. Yeah, we want to make sure that I can put my hand in here, right? This is warm. This is just comfortable bathtub warm, right? If it's any hotter than that, you don't want to put a hide in it, right? If it's hot enough to damage your hide, it's hot enough to damage your hide, okay? Just a good rule of thumb there. So we've got this nice kind of medium strength liquor. I could see my hand about 2 inches deep or so. Okay, it's not super concentrated, but it's got quite a lot of tannin in it. Mm-hmm. Now over here, I've been working with these. These are the same pig hides that I talked about the defatting greasy hide video. I'll put a link at the top of the screen here to that. So you can see where they came from. What I've done so far is I've been rehydrating them. I took them out and I did a scrub. I put some dish detergent on them and did a good scrub just with a scrubby. Okay, that is important. As I mentioned in the earlier video, all of these little hair follicles end up with a bunch of oil in them, and that kind of produces a bit of a film as it squeezes out as they dry. Right. So we needed to scrub that. And if you look at this water, you can see how it's milky. Mm-hmm. Okay. That milkiness, those are all of the little bits of fat that have been successfully scrubbed away. So that worked pretty well. I did film that. Unfortunately, I lost those files in a batch of corrupted files, so I don't have that to show you. But you could easily picture me scrubbing a hide with a little scrubby pad. Okay. So we're going to take these. I'm going to take 2 of them and move them over into the tannic acid solution and start working them in. Now these will need stirred and moved around regularly, okay? Or you will get very uneven tanning. And it's going to be somewhat uneven in color to start with, no matter how good a job you do of this. But what we want is to give them a chance to absorb the majority of the tannic acid out of this solution while it's still a relatively low volume of solution. Because every time I come and strengthen it with more of that first yield liquor, I'm going to continue building up volume, and it can get to the point where it's difficult to get the concentration high enough to do the good you want to do, simply because there's so much volume. Okay? So we don't want that. So we want to start with a relatively low volume of tanning liquor. Okay, you can see it's already just starting to pick up a little bit of that color. So we've got a nice, strong, good mixture here. Okay. Now, if I slide this out of the way for a minute, this is the third hide that was done hair off. And then here in the bottom, I have the hide that was done hair on. And this has not been absorbing the water as well as the others, which tells me this has been soaking. It's the same thickness. It's a smaller, thinner hide, if anything. But you can see, well, over here, there's some regions that have absorbed the liquid really well. There's a lot that haven't. And that tells me that we need another scrubby. So we're just going to go with some dish liquid. And we're going to just kind of work that in to try and get the oil film off of the surface. Because the treatment that we did to this one, where we were just soaking it in a very soapy alum solution, does not do as good a job as soaking it in lime, saponifying everything to the point the hair falls out. But we don't want the hair to fall out. So it makes it a little bit more difficult. However, we will take our time, we will be patient, we will be clean, we will wash, we will scrub, and we will just keep working this until we get all of that oil film taken care of and it absorbs water well. So I'm going to finish this and then give it a bit more time to soak, see how it responds, see if I need to scrub it a third time or not. And while I do that, more bark will be cooking, so that I can dump this barrel out, fill it up with bark, and I'll have these two hides in their own bark solution over here. So I'm going to get to working on that, and we'll rejoin when there's something to show. Okay, we're starting to rain here today, so I'm going to do this really, really quick, but it is about 24 hours since I put these two hides in the first bucket. And you can see what we've got. We've already taken on a lot of color, but it's really splotchy. So most of this happened overnight when I wasn't agitating them, so they kind of sat and got the tie-dyed look. Where there was a fold, it blocks the tannin from getting in. And now, if I stick my hand into the same level where I couldn't see my fingers, I can see my fingers through. So we've taken a lot of the density out of the solution. I haven't seen a whole lot more change this morning, so the bark liquor is weakened. And this is normal. I would expect this for that first, big slurp of stuff. And it's now time to add the first yield. You can see how nice and dark that is. Make our solution more voluminous so that they can swim around easier and restore that concentration of tannins. Okay? So I am going to get out of the rain and tuck this back under a roof, mix them up real good, and we'll let them soak some more. Okay, I just wanted to do a really quick intermediate kind of progress update on this little project. We are, I'm not sure exactly, week and a half or 2 weeks in. This is the hair on hide, and it's really nice and even, right? We've got a really nice even start to this. When I stretch it, I can see white showing through, and some of these places where there's a little bit of a cut and I can kind of pick away at it a little bit, I can see a lot of white showing through. So it's nowhere near done. There's a lot to go yet on it, but it is starting a nice even tan on this surface. So that's doing really nicely. You can see the whites are staining a little bit brown, but that's totally fine. It's a nice color of brown. This is one of the hair off hides. And I've been struggling with these a little bit. They just want to be patchy. So I've been tinkering with a couple of different things. For some reason, they just do not want to take up the liquor as well as this one. Now, the alum treatment does make the hide more porous and allow it to take it up easier. So it's not entirely unexpected that this one is going to go faster. But still, we want to deal with this. Now, I did a little experiment where I took them out, dried them down, and then put them back in. And that did help, right? Just to force them to take up the tannin-containing liquid. But, as you can see, in order to go forward, this is some new first yield liquor, and this is what they're currently soaking in. Okay? So it will never fully lose its color, but this is depleted of tannin and no longer good. So what do we need to do? We need to take some more high tannin first yield liquor, and we need to strengthen that up. So I'm in the process of making some more of my bark soup. We're going to strengthen this liquor. We also need to raise the water level a little bit. I ended up putting all 4 hides in the same bucket because it took just a little bit less volume to do that. So I need, and the ones on top are starting to struggle to stay all the way swimming down in. So I need a little bit more liquid, so I'm making another batch of the bark liquor. We're going to put these in. I'm going to wait a day and see if just strengthening the liquor resolves this. If not, I'm going to pull them all out and dry them again, and then put them back in. And we're just going to keep progressing. So this is just a little update video. It is mid-October, August, September, so we're a little over 2 months into this little project. As I mentioned in the previous update, I've been having trouble with splotchiness. There's regions that are absorbing the tannin really, really well, and regions of these hides that just aren't. So I did a few experiments that I talked about in the last update, letting it partially dry and then putting it back in the liquor to see if I could force it to absorb some tannin. And that helped a little bit, but not a whole lot. Okay? So, problem solving. How do you run through a troubleshooting program in your mind, right? When something's not working the way it should be, and this isn't working the way it should be, how do you run through the problem solving protocol? Well, when I did those little drying out experiments, I could see that some of the areas that had really sucked up a lot of tannin very early on, because the grain had been scratched a little bit, you know, that's really what it was. In most of the areas that absorbed it really well really early on, the grain was scratched. It was able to absorb equally well from both sides. These always absorb better on the back. You can see the back of this one than the front, right? So the grain has formed an impervious layer, right? Those, when they dried down, they didn't dry down and act like rawhide. They dried down and act like dry leather that needs an oiling really badly. Okay? So that says the tannin is concentrated enough and it's basically working. We just have a problem with an impervious layer. So what could be wrong with it? I washed the bejabbers out of them, so I know it's not a problem with too much oil residue. And also, in line with I know it's working, is the hair-on pelt there that's upside down. That absorbed really well right from the get-go, and you can see how dark it is compared to these others. You know, so I know the tannin is working. I know it's strong enough. I know I don't have bad bark, right? And it has been absorbing, the hides have been absorbing tannin because I've had to refresh the liquor several times as it gets weaker. Okay? So where it's absorbing, it's absorbing. Where it's absorbing, it is tanning. So I sat down and I did some research. And I read a bunch of old protocols. And I watched a bunch of interviews on YouTube. See, it's good that you're here on YouTube. You can learn stuff. You do that, it's right here. I watched some interviews with active commercial tanneries. And they all had something in common which I had been ignoring. Acidity. Okay? So they were either pickling the hides to soften them before they put them in the bark liquor. That's one solution some were taking. Others were adding bark that is very, very high in sugar. Low in tannin, but high in sugar. And talking about the fermentation process, producing vinegar in situ. Okay? And then I scratched my brain. It's like this one. You see, these two are in the same vat. I had trouble keeping all of the hides submerged, so I started a second vat. Okay, this vat started to produce a vinegar mother. Okay, and you can see how much farther along this one is than this one. This one started to ferment the sugars in the bark. This one didn't. Okay, and then the third, when I looked at some of the old recipes that were using oak or hemlock bark alone and not doing a pickling stage, they were adding vinegar directly to the bark when they made their first extracts. Okay, let's try that. So these two came out of the same vat originally. I took this one out and I made a liquor that was about half and half water vinegar. Okay, little extra vinegar just because of what I had, but about half and half water vinegar. And I let it soak in there for 2 weeks. And then I put it back in the original vat and added a gallon of cleaning vinegar to that vat, and then strengthened the liquor again with a little bit of concentrated, I cooked it down to almost a syrup so I could add the tannins without adding a huge volume. Okay? And that was about 2 weeks ago when I put this in. You can see how much this one colored up relative to this one. And I took this one out of the vat and put it in the vinegar pickle for the last 2 weeks, so it's about to go in with its friend. And you can see the difference that having acidity in this did over this one, which had otherwise been treated the same. Vinegar added, no vinegar added. So I think that's what the problem was. Now this very clearly has formed a relatively impervious layer here on the flesh side, on the grain side, when you compare it to the flesh side, which is absorbing a lot faster. Okay, and that's going to take time. That's going to take months for the tanning liquor to break through that. So at this point, I'm confident that my bark is working, the tanning process is working, and the acidity is correct enough that it will proceed to a finished state. So I'm going to put a period on this particular video, post it, and then I'm going to take these, and again, we're in October. The vats have been just out under a roof, but outside. I'm going to have to take them down into the cellar where they will stay above freezing. But because it's cold, both outside and once it starts to freeze and I take them down, it'll be cold inside. This is going to take a long time. It'll be spring or early summer next year till these are ready to go. Okay? So, if there's something to do a little update video on, I may do that. Otherwise, I may just wait until they're ready to finish. We'll see how it proceeds. But I wanted to get this start of a video going since these pig hides have already been up on the channel, and I wanted to show what the progress is. And I wanted to put this up as a problem-solving video because things aren't always going to work the way you expect the first time. Let me rephrase that. Things are never going to work the way you expect the first time when you're getting into a new skill, okay? I have experience working with hides, but I haven't really worked with bark that much, right? I tried it once when I was a little wee lad and it failed on me, right? So this is my second attempt at bark. So I'm not an expert on this and I have a lot to learn. But there's value in seeing the learning process in and of itself, okay? So, I'm going to go get these back in their respective vats before they dry out too much. I am working on cooking some more bark liquor down because they need to strengthen the medium here. And I hope that you enjoy this video, and if you do, I would be most grateful if you gave it a big old thumb up because that helps the algorithm know that you enjoyed it and show it to others. And I hope that you will see us here next time at Old Ways Rising.